And although you kind of know that this might happen, you don't really think about it very much. Not least of all because the monarchy is about continuity. But I think for my brother, this is something he's been waiting for. And he's probably spent more time thinking about it.
The document was already open when Princess Anne's lawyers delivered the sentence that reportedly changed the entire meeting. Camilla's family had expected questions. They had expected arguments about paperwork, occupancy, perhaps even a demand for clarification. What they had not expected was for Anne's legal team to point to an old clause and suggest that the family might never have possessed the right they believed they had. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The room had gone still around a single page of paper. One paragraph had been marked. One section of the original agreement had been enlarged for everyone to read, and according to the accounts surrounding this disputed royal property story, that passage did not simply challenge the family's future in the residence. It appeared to challenge the assumption that had protected their position for years. Then came the question that reportedly made the atmosphere turn cold. If this clause had always existed, why had nobody acted on it before? That is where this story becomes far more unsettling, because if the reported discovery is accurate, Princess Anne was not simply trying to remove Camilla's family from a home. Her lawyers had allegedly uncovered something buried inside the property's original arrangements that could explain why the family had been allowed to remain there for so long.
For the rest of us, it's more a question of, okay, we have to shift the way we support. And that's what we need to do.
And what does that shift look like for you?
Well, that's we don't know yet. I mean, there was an order to the years.
Despite wording that appeared to place serious limits on their rights. Hi viewers, if this were your family and lawyers suddenly told you that the home you had trusted for years was never legally secure, would you speak up or stay silent? Leave your answer in the comments, because sometimes staying silent is exactly how an old arrangement survives. The pressure inside that room reportedly intensified as Anne's legal advisors moved from the original agreement to later documents. Correspondence was examined, financial records were questioned, dates were compared, signatures were placed beside one another. What had once looked like a straightforward family arrangement was beginning to resemble something much more complicated. And the most uncomfortable part was not that the documents were old, it was that they appeared to tell a different story from the one people had been living. Camilla's family had reportedly relied on an understanding that their occupancy was protected. Years of familiarity had strengthened that belief. The residence had become more than a place connected to the family. It had become something they could reasonably regard as home. But Anne's lawyers were allegedly looking at the matter differently. They were not asking how long the family had been there. They were asking what gave them the legal right to remain. That distinction changed everything. A promise could be remembered. An assurance could be repeated. A family understanding could survive for decades. But an old agreement could still contain a restriction that none of those things could erase. And then the lawyers reportedly found the inconsistency that forced the entire arrangement into question. A later document appeared to describe the family's position in terms that were far more secure than the original paperwork seemed to permit. The difference was subtle enough to escape attention for years, yet significant enough to become devastating once someone finally compared the documents side by side. That was the moment Anne's position reportedly became impossible to dismiss as a personal dispute. This was no longer simply about whether Camilla's relatives should stay. It was about whether the arrangement itself had ever been legally capable of giving them what they believed they had. And there was another problem. Someone had known about the original paperwork. Someone had allowed the later understanding to develop. Someone had watched the arrangement become stronger with every passing year, while the old clause remained buried underneath it. The lawyers now had a much bigger question to answer. Who knew? Because if nobody knew, this could have been a catastrophic oversight. But if someone did know, the story changed completely. Anne's team reportedly requested more records. Not just the agreement. everything connected to it: letters, financial documents, property correspondence, previous legal advice, anything that could reveal how the original restriction had been interpreted and why later arrangements appeared to move in a different direction. And somewhere inside that paper trail was the answer Camilla's family reportedly never expected to find. The clause was not merely an obstacle. It appeared to contain the reason the residence could never become theirs in the way they had assumed. That discovery was about to turn an old family understanding into a legal confrontation.
The ability to have somebody who is kind of epitomizes what you think your country stands for has always been a major ambition. And it's a huge advantage if you have somebody who can be recognized as that, not just in your country, but around the world. You know, people don't change that much. I think they recognize those people whose commitment has been constant, and they know that those standards are not changing.
And before the meeting was over, the question would no longer be whether Anne's lawyers could challenge the arrangement. It would be whether Camilla's family had any defensible right to keep calling the residence home at all. The first thing Camilla's family reportedly lost was not the house, it was certainty. By the time Anne's lawyers began comparing the old agreement with the later occupancy arrangements, the family had already spent years treating the residence as secure. That belief did not appear overnight. It had been reinforced through conversations, decisions, practical arrangements, and the simple passage of time. Every year they remained there seemed to confirm what they had been told. The longer the arrangement continued, the harder it became to imagine that a document hidden in an old file could suddenly threaten it. That is precisely why the lawyer's review reportedly caused such alarm. According to the account surrounding the dispute, those expectations were supported by years of assurances that the arrangement was understood and accepted. But Anne's legal team was looking at something much colder. They were looking at the original terms. And original terms have a dangerous habit of surviving memories. A conversation can be remembered differently by two people. A promise can become broader every time it is repeated. A family understanding can gradually turn into something that feels almost indistinguishable from a legal right.
You know, learning on not making assumptions, and certainly not throwing your weight around.
So in other words, your mother set the example, and it was an example for you to follow, but she was always there should you need some advice, some guidance, some help.
If you had a question that was specific, and that was true of some events, that would certainly be necessary.
But the wording written into an agreement does not become more generous simply because decades have passed. Camilla's family could point to history. They could point to years of occupation. They could point to arrangements that appeared to acknowledge their connection to the residents. They could argue that the family had relied on those assurances and had every reason to believe the arrangement was legitimate. Anne's lawyers, however, were allegedly asking a much narrower question. What did the original document actually allow? The distinction also changed the stakes. If the family had misunderstood the agreement, then years of confidence could collapse without anyone intending to cause harm. If the later arrangements had exceeded what the original document permitted, then people relying on them could suddenly find themselves defending decisions they had never made. That uncertainty was dangerous because it left everyone waiting for the same thing, the exact wording that would determine whether the residence was theirs to keep, for everyone involved there. Because once the legal advisors began tracing the paperwork backward, the later arrangements started looking less like a complete answer and more like pieces of a puzzle that had been assembled without the original picture. There were reportedly differences between the historic wording and later understandings. Some language appeared to describe occupancy in a way that could be interpreted more generously than the original agreement. Other records raised questions about whether subsequent decisions had ever received the authority they were assumed to have. And suddenly, every year that Camilla's family had remained at the residence became relevant, not because time itself created guilt, because time created evidence. The longer an arrangement existed, the more correspondence it generated. The more money was spent, the more records appeared. The more people became involved, the more difficult it became to maintain a single version of events. That was reportedly where Anne's lawyers began digging. They wanted to know who had approved what, who had interpreted the original agreement, who had authorized later changes, who had been told about the restrictions, and perhaps most importantly, who had believed those restrictions no longer mattered. Those questions carried a weight far beyond the residence itself. If the later arrangements had been made in good faith, the dispute could still be explained as a monumental misunderstanding.
Well, we don't, in many respects, need to deal with it. Not least of all because it is the monarch that is the key to this, and the constitution that underpins the monarchy.
But if someone had understood the original restrictions and proceeded anyway, then the confrontation would become much harder to dismiss. The family's resistance reportedly made the situation even more complicated. Their position was understandable from their perspective. If people had spent years being told that their place at the residence was secure, suddenly being told that lawyers had found a problem in an old agreement would feel less like a technical correction and more like the ground disappearing beneath their feet. And yet, none of that answered the question Anne's lawyers were asking. A long-standing arrangement is not automatically a permanent one. That became the uncomfortable dividing line. On one side was history, on the other was the document, and the document was beginning to win. The pressure reportedly increased when Anne's advisors asked for financial records connected to the residence. Those records mattered because money can reveal intentions that polite conversations never do. If substantial expenses had been approved on the assumption that Camilla's family would remain, those payments could help establish how the arrangement had actually been understood inside the family. If improvements had been made specifically around their continued occupancy, they could show that the expectation was not casual. If correspondence connected those expenses to a future right to remain, the evidence could become even more significant. But the reverse was also possible. If the financial records showed that payments had been made without proper authority, or that certain improvements had been approved under an assumption the original agreement did not support, then the records could strengthen Anne's lawyer's position. It was not simply about finding one sentence. It was about reconstructing how a belief had become an arrangement, and then determining whether that arrangement had ever possessed the legal foundation everyone assumed it had. There was another detail that reportedly unsettled the family. The lawyers were not relying on one later copy. They were looking backward. They wanted the earliest version available, the original language, the signatures, the amendments, the dates, the people involved. Their approach suggested something important. Anne's advisors were trying to establish what the property arrangement had meant before later assumptions took hold. If you believe an old promise should be enough to protect a family from suddenly losing its home, then this is exactly where your support matters. Leave a like, share this story with someone who would challenge a decision like this, and subscribe. Because when powerful families can rely on silence and old assumptions, staying silent can make those assumptions look permanent. Inside the legal review, however, nobody was treating the matter as permanent anymore. The documents were being pulled apart. The dates were being checked. The later arrangements were being compared against the original language. And then the lawyers found something that reportedly changed the direction of the investigation. It was not another promise. It was not another financial record. It was an older document, one that appeared to explain why the original agreement contained the restriction in the first place. That discovery was important because until then, the family could still argue that the disputed clause had been misunderstood. But if its original purpose could be established, the argument would become much harder. The clause would no longer look like an obscure sentence buried in old paperwork. It would look deliberate. And that was the point where Anne's legal review reportedly stopped being a question about what had gone wrong recently. It became a question about what someone had tried to prevent long before the current dispute ever existed. The residence was still standing, the family was still there, nothing visible had changed. But inside the paperwork, the ground had shifted, and the next document was about to reveal why. The older document was not sitting in the place anyone expected. It had been separated from the more recent property files, filed under an earlier description of the residence, and according to the account surrounding this dispute, that small administrative detail may have been the reason the controversy remained buried for so long. When Anne's legal advisors finally placed the document beside the later occupancy papers, the contradiction became difficult to ignore. The newer arrangement appeared to support the family's continued use of the home. The older agreement appeared to limit it. Neither document could simply be wished away. And that was when the lawyers reportedly stopped asking whether the family had been treated as occupants and started asking a far more dangerous question. Who had the authority to make them permanent? That question cut directly through years of assumptions. A person could be welcomed into a residence. A family could be encouraged to use it. Money could be spent maintaining it. Rooms could be prepared for them. People could even speak about the property as though its future had already been decided. But none of those things necessarily changed the underlying legal position. The original agreement remained the reference point. According to the reported account, Anne's advisors began examining every amendment attached to it. They were looking for language that might have changed the original restriction, transferred authority, or created an exception that would protect Camilla's family. One amendment appeared promising, then it failed under closer examination. Another document seemed to give the family greater security, but again, the wording did not clearly override the original terms. The lawyers were effectively rebuilding the history of the property, one page at a time, and every page created another question. That is what made the situation so tense. If there had been one obvious mistake, it could have been corrected. If there had been one missing signature, someone could have explained it. If there had been one outdated clause, a later amendment might have settled the matter. Instead, the paperwork reportedly showed layers of decisions made at different times, under different understandings, with the original restrictions still sitting underneath them. Then the financial records entered the picture. Anne's team reportedly requested records connected to maintenance, improvements, and other expenses associated with the residence. The purpose was not simply to calculate money, it was to determine what the people making those payments believed they were building toward. The records could reveal whether the family had been treated as temporary occupants or expected future residents. They could show whether improvements were ordinary maintenance or preparations connected to a longer arrangement. They could reveal who authorized the spending, and they could establish when those decisions were made. That timeline mattered, because if expensive improvements had been approved after the original restriction had already been acknowledged, the question would become much sharper. Was someone acting on a genuine misunderstanding, or had the paperwork been understood and simply set aside? Nobody needed to accuse anyone of wrongdoing for that question to become uncomfortable. The documents could create the tension by themselves. One reported record allegedly referred to future use of the property in language that sounded more permanent than the original agreement allowed. Another piece of correspondence appeared to treat the family's continued occupancy as settled. But settled by whom? That question kept returning. And eventually, the lawyers reportedly found something even more significant. A later arrangement had been treated as though it could expand the family's rights without clearly changing the original agreement itself. That distinction was crucial. An informal understanding could explain conduct. A letter could explain intention. A payment could explain preparation. But if none of those things legally amended the original agreement, then they could not necessarily create a permanent right where the original document had withheld one. That was the legal fault line. Camilla's family could say they had relied on what they had been told. Anne's lawyers could respond that reliance did not automatically rewrite the agreement. Neither side needed to raise their voice. The documents were doing the arguing. And then came the detail that reportedly made the entire review more serious. The original agreement did not appear to contain the restriction by accident. Its wording suggested that the people who created it had anticipated a future change in circumstances. That was the discovery that transformed the story. Because until that point, there was still an innocent explanation. Perhaps the original terms had simply been forgotten. Perhaps later generations had interpreted them differently. Perhaps nobody had realized that an arrangement created years earlier could become relevant to a completely different family situation. But if the restriction had been deliberately written to control what happened when circumstances changed, then the old document was not an obstacle created by accident. It was a safeguard, and that meant the lawyers now had to determine what that safeguard was protecting. The answer could decide everything. They reportedly began examining the identities of the people who had created and amended the agreement, the circumstances surrounding those decisions, and the language used to describe future occupancy. That was when a second layer of the story began to emerge. The residence was not simply being treated as a home, it was being treated as an asset whose future control had to be protected. That difference sounds technical until it changes someone's life. A home can be inherited emotionally. An asset is controlled legally. And the original agreement appeared to care far more about the second than the first. For Camilla's family, that meant years of familiarity could no longer guarantee the future. For Anne, it meant the legal review had a foundation that did not depend on personal feelings toward Camilla or her relatives. That distinction was important. If Anne had simply ordered the family out, the story would have been easy to frame as a royal family feud. But the reported events pointed towards something colder. Anne's lawyers were allegedly allowing the documents to determine the outcome. And the deeper they went, the less the dispute looked like a personal decision. Then they found the phrase that reportedly changed the interpretation of everything around it. It was buried inside the original wording. Short, easy to overlook, but powerful enough to determine what could happen to the residents. The lawyers reportedly read it more than once. Then they compared it against the later arrangements. The conflict was immediate. The later understanding depended on a right the original agreement appeared to restrict. That meant the question was no longer whether Camilla's family had been treated as though they belonged there. They clearly had been. The question was whether that treatment had ever been enough to give them the permanent security they believed they possessed. And if it had not, then the next question was devastating. Why had the family been allowed to believe otherwise for so long? That question was still unanswered. But one thing was becoming clear. The residents had not suddenly become vulnerable because Anne decided to challenge it. It had been vulnerable from the moment that original clause was written. Nobody had needed to remove it. Nobody had needed to rewrite it. It had simply been waiting. Waiting for someone to notice. Waiting for someone to compare the old agreement with the newer promises. Waiting for a lawyer to ask the question nobody had wanted to ask. And now that question had finally been asked. The next stage of the review would not focus on what Camilla's family believed. It would focus on who had known the truth about the original agreement, who had acted on later assumptions, and whether the people responsible for those decisions had ever understood that the residence could not simply become theirs. That was the point where a property dispute became something far more personal. Because the paperwork was no longer only threatening a home, it was threatening the credibility of every assurance that had allowed the family to believe the home was theirs to keep. And that was the question Anne's lawyers reportedly carried into the next meeting. Not who deserved sympathy, and not who had been promised what, but who had understood the rule and why that understanding had never reached the people living inside the house. If that answer existed in another forgotten record, finding it could change the entire meaning of the dispute for everyone. The answer was sitting in a document nobody in the room had expected to matter anymore. Anne's lawyers reportedly found it while tracing the history of the original agreement, and the discovery changed the question completely. Until that moment, the dispute had been about whether a later arrangement could protect Camilla's family's continued occupation. Now the lawyers were looking backward at the reason the original restriction had been written. That was the dangerous part. A restriction written decades earlier could have been an ordinary technical condition. It could have been included for administrative reasons and forgotten. But the wording reportedly suggested something more deliberate. It appeared to anticipate a future situation in which people connected to the property through family relationships might claim rights that the original agreement had never intended to give them. The lawyers reportedly compared the clause with the later arrangements again. The pattern became difficult to dismiss. The original agreement protected the long-term control of the residence. The later understanding treated Camilla's family as though their position could continue indefinitely. Between those two positions sat years of assumptions, assurances, and decisions that had never clearly changed the original rule. And suddenly, the old clause looked less like a technical obstacle and more like a locked door. Someone had built that door for a reason. That was the moment the investigation reportedly became personal, even without anyone raising their voice. Because if the original restriction had been designed to prevent a future transfer of control, then the current dispute was not an unexpected accident. It was precisely the kind of situation the original agreement had been designed to prevent. The question became, who had understood that intention? Anne's legal advisors reportedly went further into the correspondence surrounding the agreement. They were looking for evidence of how the restriction had been explained when it was created, and whether later decision-makers had ever been formally informed that the residence could not simply be treated as a permanent family possession. The distinction mattered enormously. If nobody had understood the clause, the story could still be explained as an institutional failure. If people had understood it and continued making promises anyway, the consequences would be far more serious. That was the point at which Camilla's family's strongest argument also became its greatest vulnerability. They could say they had relied on what they had been told, but reliance creates another question. Who gave the assurance, and what authority did that person actually have? A promise from someone with influence can feel absolute inside a powerful family. It can shape where people live, where they spend money, what improvements they approve, and what they tell their children about the future. Yet none of that necessarily changes the legal ownership or occupancy structure underneath it. That gap between personal assurance and legal authority was becoming the center of the dispute, and the lawyers reportedly found evidence that made the gap even harder to explain. Some later correspondence appeared to assume that Camilla's family would remain connected to the residence for the long term. The language was confident. There was no suggestion that their position was temporary or uncertain. But the original agreement had never been rewritten in equally clear terms. That left a troubling possibility. The family may have been operating under an understanding that became stronger through repetition, even though the document capable of creating that right remained unchanged. This was where the emotional weight of the dispute became impossible to ignore. Imagine believing for years that a particular room will remain yours. Imagine making plans around a place because everyone around you behaves as though the future has already been decided. Then imagine discovering that the certainty was built on an interpretation rather than a guaranteed right. The shock would not come only from losing the residence, it would come from realizing that the loss had been hidden inside the paperwork from the beginning. And according to the reported account, Anne's lawyers were now prepared to confront that reality. The resistance from Camilla's side reportedly intensified. Their position was that the family's long-standing connection to the residence could not simply be erased because someone had rediscovered an old clause. They could point to the conduct of the people who had administered the property. They could point to years of accepted arrangements. They could argue that everyone had acted as though the family's position was legitimate. But Anne's lawyers allegedly returned to the same point. The original agreement had not disappeared. Neither had its restrictions, and that made every later arrangement dependent on a question of authority. Who had the power to change the original terms? If the answer was nobody acting informally, then years of assurances could not accomplish what a formal amendment had failed to accomplish. That was the legal trap. The family had a history. Anne had the document. Then came the discovery that reportedly shocked even people who believed they understood the dispute. The original clause appeared to protect not only the physical residence, but the future control attached to it. That meant the issue was larger than who slept in the house. It concerned who could ultimately decide what happened to the property, who could preserve it, who could transfer rights, who could determine its future, and who could not. That distinction suddenly made the residence look very different. It was no longer simply a home being contested by relatives. It was a piece of property governed by rules that had survived every change in family circumstances. And that was where Princess Anne's role became so powerful. She did not need to create a new rule. She did not need to invent a new restriction. Her legal advisors only needed to establish what the existing agreement already said. That is why the reported confrontation carried such weight. If the lawyers were correct, Anne was not taking something away simply because she wanted it. She was challenging an arrangement because the paperwork allegedly showed that the arrangement had exceeded its original boundaries. And that interpretation placed a completely different burden on the opposing side. They now had to explain not why they loved the home, not why they had lived there, and not why they had trusted the arrangement, but what legal instrument had actually given them the right they were claiming. That is a much harder question. Then another document reportedly surfaced. It appeared to show that the original restriction had been acknowledged at some point during the property's history. The detail was crucial, because if the restriction had once been acknowledged, the argument that everyone simply forgot it became weaker. Someone had seen it. Someone had understood enough of it to record or acknowledge its existence, and yet the later arrangements had continued. That discovery reportedly left Anne's team with one final piece missing. They needed to know whether the people who relied on the later arrangement had ever been shown the original clause. If they had, the dispute could become explosive. If they had not, then the story could become a tragedy of institutional silence. Either way, the residence was heading toward a decision, and the people inside the family were no longer simply debating where someone could live. They were confronting the possibility that 15 years of certainty could collapse because of a paragraph written long before the current dispute existed. If this makes you question how easily powerful families can let old promises become accepted truth, do not just watch and move on. Like this video, share it with someone who believes the paperwork should matter, and subscribe. Every click tells the story that silence should not decide who gets protected and who gets pushed aside. If Anne's lawyers were right, looking away would mean allowing the old assumption to survive unchallenged for years. That is why the next stage mattered more than anything that had come before. The lawyers were reportedly preparing to establish the original purpose of the clause, the authority behind the later arrangements, and the identity of the people who had allowed the two versions of the story to exist side by side. And once those three pieces were connected, the final answer would become almost impossible to avoid. The home had not suddenly become contested. The conflict had been waiting inside the agreement all along, and now Anne's lawyers were finally forcing everyone to read it. The final page reportedly settled what 15 years of assumptions could not. Anne's legal advisors had reached the point where there was nowhere left to hide behind custom, family expectations, or later promises. The original agreement had been found. The restriction had been identified. The later arrangements had been compared against it, and the question that had opened this entire dispute finally had an answer. Camilla's family could not rely on the residence being theirs because everyone had treated it that way. That was the conclusion reportedly presented after the legal review, and the reason was buried in the original agreement. The clause was not simply about who could sleep in the house. It concerned the future control and use of the property. It limited what could be granted through later arrangements, and, according to the accounts surrounding the dispute, prevented an informal family understanding from becoming a permanent right. That distinction was devastating. For years, the residence had apparently been surrounded by an assumption that its future was already settled. But the lawyers had reached a different conclusion. The family had been occupying a place that could feel permanent without possessing the legal security they believed came with it. That is why the reported decision carried such emotional force. Nobody needed to accuse Camilla's relatives of stealing anything. Nobody needed to claim that every person involved had acted maliciously. The paperwork itself created the confrontation. Once the original terms were taken seriously, the later arrangements had to be questioned, and the family was reportedly given a choice that no one expected to face, except that the occupancy arrangement could not continue as previously understood, or challenge the legal interpretation and force the dispute into an even more serious confrontation. The possibility of leaving was no longer theoretical. It had become the consequence sitting at the end of the paper trail, and this is where Princess Anne's role became striking. She did not need to storm into the residence. She did not need a dramatic public announcement. Her lawyers had already done the work. They had gone backward through the records and found the rule that had been there before the current assumptions took shape. That made the outcome feel less in the eyes of the family like an eviction ordered in anger, and more like an old decision finally being enforced. The reported reaction from Camilla's side was understandable. Years of certainty do not disappear because a lawyer places a paragraph on a table. People build routines around homes. They invest emotionally in rooms. They make plans. They imagine the next year and the year after that. Then one document can make all of those plans suddenly uncertain. The cruelest part was that the family reportedly did not lose the residence because something new had been written against them. They lost the protection they thought they had because something old had finally been read closely. That is a different kind of shock. It means the danger was never approaching from outside. It had been sitting inside the agreement from the beginning. And that brings the story back to the question raised at the start. Why had nobody acted sooner? The reported explanation is not necessarily a conspiracy. It could have been decades of assumptions, incomplete legal understanding, changing family circumstances, and people trusting arrangements that appeared settled because nobody had challenged them. But there is another possibility that makes the story far more uncomfortable. Someone may have understood the restriction. Someone may have known that the later arrangement was vulnerable. And someone may have decided that as long as nobody opened the old file, the problem could remain buried. There is no basis here to declare that as established fact. But it is precisely the possibility that makes the dispute so compelling. Because the difference between an innocent oversight and a deliberate silence can be enormous. Either way, Anne's lawyers reportedly did what nobody had done for years. They opened the file. They followed the wording, they traced the amendments, they questioned the later arrangements. And they forced the family to confront the difference between what had been promised and what could actually be guaranteed. That distinction may be the most important part of the entire story. A royal promise can carry enormous emotional power, but a promise cannot automatically rewrite an agreement. A family tradition can become deeply rooted, but tradition does not necessarily create ownership, and a home can feel permanent, but permanence has to come from somewhere. In this case, the lawyers reportedly believed that source was missing. That is why the title sounds more dramatic than the legal reality underneath it. Princess Anne did not wake up one morning and decide that Camilla's family should lose their home. The reported dispute was more complicated. Her legal advisors challenged an arrangement because an older document allegedly showed that the family did not possess the security everyone had assumed. And once that interpretation was accepted, the future of the residence changed. The rooms could remain, the walls could remain, the property itself could remain exactly where it had always stood. What disappeared was the assumption that Camilla's family could remain there indefinitely. That is the part that makes this story linger. A home can survive a legal decision, A family can survive losing a residence, but certainty is harder to recover. If the reported account is accurate, that certainty had been built over years, perhaps over generations, through words that sounded stronger than the documents behind them. And now the documents had spoken. If you believe a powerful family should not be able to bury inconvenient paperwork beneath years of silence, this is the moment to make your position count. Like this video, share it with someone who would want to know what was hidden in that old agreement, and subscribe. Doing nothing lets the most convenient version of the story keep winning. A like, a share, and a subscription tells the people watching that forgotten documents still deserve to be examined, especially when someone's home and future are on the line. But there is one detail that makes the entire dispute more unsettling. The clause did not need Princess Anne to exist. It did not need today's royal tensions. It did not need Camilla's family. It was already there, waiting. And that means the real power in this story was never the person who demanded the home be surrendered. It was the person who had written the rule long before anyone knew it would matter. That is why the lawyer's discovery reportedly shocked everyone involved. They did not uncover a brand new weapon, they uncovered an old one, and once it was finally placed beside the later agreements, the years of certainty surrounding the residence began to collapse. The question is therefore not simply whether Princess Anne stripped Camilla's family of their home. It is whether the family ever possessed the permanent right to call it theirs in the first place. If Anne's lawyers were right, then the answer had been waiting inside that agreement all along. The residence was never protected by silence. It was protected by a clause, and for years, nobody had looked closely enough to see it.